Hey guys, tonight we slip into the buzzing, humming, oddly charming world of 18th century beekeepers. A world filled with sweet honey, serious danger, and some of the strangest hats you've ever seen. You're here now, standing at the edge of a blooming orchard where clouds of bees dance in golden afternoon light. The air is thick with the scent of wildflowers, warm wax, and a faint smoky tinge carried on the breeze. Ahead, a handful of beekeepers shuffle cautiously around towering wicker hives. And there's the real spectacle, their outfits. Enormous brimmed hats with flowing veils, stiff collars, and sometimes even tall, almost comically shaped helmets that make them look like something between plague doctors and lost circus performers. You squint at one elderly keeper whose headgear seems to include both feathers and ribbons. You probably won't survive this, honestly. One wrong move, and you're the main course for several hundred annoyed stingers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And of course, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You inch forward, boots crunching softly over the grass, drawn by the rhythmic whoosh of bellows as a keeper puffs smoke into a hive entrance. The bees swirl lazily in response, their aggression dulled just enough to allow this delicate work to proceed. The beekeeper's strange hat sways slightly as he leans in its gauzy veil, catching the sun. It's hard not to stare. These aren't modern mesh head nets or simple straw hats. No, this is high drama. Large brims nearly as wide as their shoulders, veils draped all the way down past their waists, some even reinforced with stiffeners to prevent fabric from collapsing onto skin. You wonder, how did it come to this? Why would anyone don such elaborate headgear just to pull a bit of honey from a hive? The answer, as you're beginning to see, lies somewhere at the intersection of necessity, superstition, science, and a very human urge to make even practical garments feel a bit theatrical. You notice the keepers work carefully but confidently, hand steady motions, slow. Every beekeeper here knows the dance. One false move, one sudden jolt, and the buzzing calm can turn into a furious cloud of tiny lances. The hat is their first line of defense, and in the 18th century, before epinephrine pens and proper antihistamines, a bee sting wasn't just painful. For some, it was deadly. Historians still argue whether the elaborate nature of these hats evolved purely out of practical necessity, or whether cultural and aesthetic trends amplified their eccentric designs. After all, when survival is involved, people tend to innovate, but they also tend to add flair. You glance to your left, where a younger beekeeper adjusts his veil with practiced fingers. His hat, while equally strange, appears slightly more utilitarian, perhaps made by a local craftsperson who prioritized function over fashion. The veil is finer, the brim slightly smaller. You realize there wasn't one universal design. These hats evolved through personal preference, regional tradition, and a whole lot of trial and error. And speaking of error, here's your quirky tidbit. In rural parts of Europe, some beekeepers even experimented with glass panels stitched into their veils, hoping to see better while staying protected. The idea was clever, until the sun reflected off the glass, enraging the bees even more. Not exactly OSHA approved. The smoky aroma thickens as another puff sends bees drifting lazily away. One elderly woman, her hat towering like a felt lighthouse, gently lifts a honeycomb frame glistening with golden liquid. The hat keeps her face shaded, protected, but also oddly regal. She works like a queen among queens. Around you, the apiary hums with a peaceful rhythm. The bees don't mind the hats or the smoke or even your presence so long as you respect their rules. The keepers murmur softly, a kind of reverent mantra passed between generations. Slow hands, soft breath, steady heart. As you linger, you can't help but feel both amused and oddly impressed. This isn't just about honey. It's about survival ingenuity and an entire culture that sprang up around these tiny buzzing architects. The hats, they're just the most visible part of the story. And as you'll soon see, this strange headgear didn't appear overnight. It emerged from centuries of evolving danger, growing industry, and the unstoppable march of both science and superstition. You step deeper into the orchard, feeling the warm afternoon sun on your back as the hum of the apiary swells like a living heartbeat. Here in the 18th century, beekeeping isn't some quirky backyard hobby, it's big business. And like any booming industry, it comes with its own special dangers, rewards, and of course, very strange fashion choices. You pause near a busy market stall where jars of golden honey gleam in the sunlight, stacked like treasure. Beeswax candles neatly wrapped in linen sit beside medicinal salves and sweetmeats flavored with honey. A merchant waves enthusiastically, eager to sell his shimmering wares. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 18th century, beekeeping had exploded across Europe. Honey wasn't just a luxury. It was one of the few widely available sweeteners before refined sugar became common. Beeswax was essential for candles, especially in churches, and honey also found its way into medicines, cosmetics, and alcoholic beverages like mead. And here's your quirky tidbit. Apothecaries of the time swore by honey for everything from soothing sore throats to treating wounds and even easing digestive troubles. One particularly enthusiastic 18th century physician claimed that honey mixed with crushed pearls could brighten a lady's complexion beyond nature itself. Not FDA approved, obviously. Historians still argue whether this surge in demand for bee products was more driven by medical superstition, culinary trends, or genuine scarcity of alternatives. What's clear is that with booming demand came booming beekeeping, and with booming beekeeping came an urgent need for protection. You stroll past rows of carefully stacked woven skeps, those iconic dome-shaped hives made of coiled straw. They sit like squat little temples humming with life. Each one holds thousands of buzzing workers busily producing honey, caring for larvae, and protecting their queen with fierce loyalty. You notice a young apprentice approaching one skep, face tense, hands trembling slightly. His hat is wide-brimmed with gauze draping down over his shoulders like a protective curtain. The master beekeeper gently places a hand on his shoulder. Breathe, lad. They smell your fear. Because yes, bees can sense your nervous energy. Or at least that's what generations of beekeepers believed. Move too fast, sweat too much, or heaven forbid drop a frame of comb, and you'll quickly find yourself the target of several hundred angry stingers. The problem wasn't just the pain of a single sting, though that was bad enough. Here's where things turned serious. Multiple stings could trigger dangerous allergic reactions, and even those without allergies risked severe swelling, fever, and infection long before antibiotics existed. You edge closer to a cluster of beekeepers discussing their gear. One older and clearly more experienced lifts his odd-looking hat and gives you a wink. Lost my left ear to a swarm 10 summers ago. Haven't gone near a hive without a proper hat since. That's when it clicks for you. These strange hats weren't eccentric fashion statements. They were life insurance policies made from straw-felt linen and occasionally sheer desperation. You overhear a heated debate between two nearby keepers. One insists on wearing a heavy structured hat with thick horsehair veils, while the other swears by a lighter design with finer mesh. I'd rather sweat than swell, the first one growls. The second shrugs. I prefer to see what I'm doing. Historians still debate which design was truly superior. Some argue that lighter veils offered better visibility and airflow, while others point out that denser materials better blocked stingers and prevented fatal mistakes. And of course, not all bees were created equal. You watch as one beekeeper discusses the temperament of his hive. These Italians are gentler, he says. But that Saxon stock, they'll chase you half a mile if you breathe wrong. Different breeds meant different risks and different protective strategies. You turn your gaze toward a distant manor where wealthier beekeepers have built elaborate brick apiaries, complete with tiled roofs and raised platforms. Their hats naturally reflect their status, some embroidered, some trimmed in lace or velvet, as if daring the bees to recognize their superior station. As you continue walking, you can't help but marvel at how this entire booming industry spun around such tiny creatures. Bees, barely longer than your thumbnail, managed to shape not just diets, but economies, medicine trade routes, and yes, even fashion. But as demand grew, so did the danger. And to face that danger, beekeepers got creative, leading to an evolving parade of increasingly bizarre and often quite clever headgear. Which means, of course, you're about to see the first real experiments that eventually gave rise to those delightfully strange hats you're still seeing all around you. You follow the path deeper into the buzzing orchard as the afternoon breeze carries the sharp floral scent of propolis and honey. Around you, the beekeepers continue their careful work, always slow, always deliberate. And now you start to fully understand why their strange hats became such a necessary obsession. You stand still for a moment, feeling it, that low vibrating hum, like the ground itself, is softly humming beneath your feet. A living current of wings. The sheer density of bees is dizzying. And at any given moment, thousands of them float just inches from exposed skin. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Honeybees defend their hive with an aggressive dedication that would make any army proud. A threatened hive triggers an immediate release of alarm, pheromones, chemicals that summon nearby bees into coordinated, often brutal defense swarms. These pheromones linger on human skin, clothing, even breath, making the initial sting only the beginning of your problems. You shift your weight ever so slightly, and one bee circles your ear, investigating. You freeze. Every beekeeper knows the rules: don't swat, don't flinch, don't panic. The strange hat may keep the bees off your face, but your hands and breath can still betray you. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some early beekeepers tried rubbing themselves with crushed herbs, garlic, or even vinegar before approaching a hive, hoping to mask their scent and avoid triggering those defensive chemical alarms. The results mixed, to say the least. You can only imagine how inviting garlic-scented sweat must have been in the July heat. Historians still argue whether these scent-based strategies were rooted more in folk wisdom or genuine empirical trial and error. Some suggest the herbal remedies worked primarily because they calmed the humans, not the bees. A beekeeper thinking he was safer might simply move more confidently and carefully. You notice now how each strange hat evolved to solve a very particular problem. Early beekeepers often began with simple, wide-brimmed straw hats, great for shading the face, but completely useless against bees crawling underneath or squeezing through loose weave. From there, veils were added, at first little more than draped cloth. But a breeze could easily press soft fabric directly against skin, giving determined bees easy access. So keepers began stiffening their veils. Wire hoops or bone rings were sewn into the cloth to keep the fabric suspended away from the face. Some daring souls even used whalebone for its lightness and flexibility, giving their hats that unmistakable tall, rigid appearance. Part bonnet, part helmet, part medieval lampshade. You approach one older gentleman whose hat includes not just rings and veils, but decorative stitching around the brim. The embroidery keeps the ladies impressed. He chuckles, and the bees confused. You're not entirely convinced about the second part. Even the color of the fabric mattered. You overhear a debate. Dark veils draw their attention. One beekeeper insists. Always wear white or pale gray. Another mutters, white makes me look like a walking bedsheet. But they all agree, avoid black. To bees, darker shades resemble predators like bears. You don't want to walk into a hive looking like something that eats hives. You begin to appreciate the psychological layer at play. The elaborate hats didn't just physically protect beekeepers, they also gave them confidence. A nervous, unprotected beekeeper made more mistakes, moved more erratically, and quickly triggered a defensive swarm. The hat was as much armor for the mind as it was for the skin. You watch a younger keeper nervously adjust his veil before approaching a particularly irritable hive. The master nearby offers advice. The hat makes you invisible to their anger. Walk as if you are smoke itself. And speaking of smoke, every hat worked hand in hand with the bellows. You watch the steady stream of white puffs drift into hive entrances, temporarily disrupting the bees' communication and buying precious moments of calm. Without smoke and proper headgear, even the bravest beekeeper was playing a dangerous game. Here's another fringe debate. Some modern scholars argue that the increasing elaborateness of the hats wasn't strictly necessary at all. That calmer, properly handled bees required far less protection. Others point out that 8th century beekeepers had limited control over hive genetics, and far wilder strains of bees made such gear essential. Breeding docile bees would come much later. As you stand there, another gust of wind makes one beekeeper's veil flutter dangerously close to his face. Instantly, his hand darts up to pull it taut again. You realize how constant the attention had to be. These hats weren't foolproof barriers. They were delicate balancing acts between protection, vision, comfort, and not inviting a painful swarm. And yet, despite all these challenges, these keepers return again and again to the hives drawn by the promise of sweet honey and glowing candles, and armed with nothing more than their smoke, their skill, and their increasingly peculiar headgear. But you're only just beginning to see how strange these hats could get. Because next you'll watch them evolve from practical tools into full-blown icons of bizarre fashion, inspired, oddly enough, by some of the darkest chapters of medical history. You shift your gaze now to a particularly odd group of beekeepers gathered near the far side of the orchard. At first glance, you wonder if you've wandered into some kind of bizarre costume party. Their hats are taller, more rigid, and oddly familiar. Long, protruding shapes, sharp silhouettes, some with curving snouts extending outward like elongated bird beaks. For a second, you do a double-take, plague doctors. Here's your mainstream historical fact. As strange as it seems, early beekeeping headgear in the 18th century occasionally borrowed design elements inspired by plague doctor masks of earlier centuries. The long-nosed plague masks had been designed to filter miasmas, or bad air believed to carry disease. While the beekeepers didn't expect to catch the plague from bees, the concept of fully enclosing and distancing the face carried over. You watch one beekeeper adjust his towering hat, its exaggerated forward extension casting a strange shadow across the grass. The tip is stuffed with aromatic herbs, lavender, rosemary, even crushed mint, much like plague doctors once did to combat stench and disease. Keeps the bees calm, he says confidently. You're not entirely sure the bees would agree. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some of these elongated beekeeper masks weren't just about airflow or scent. They were designed in part to psychologically intimidate the bees. The idea was that a tall, looming silhouette might deter aggressive swarming. Whether that actually worked is debatable at best. Historians still argue whether these plague doctor-inspired designs were based on functional observation or simply superstition mingling with leftover medieval medical theories. The 8th century straddled both worlds, a curious blend of blossoming science and stubborn old beliefs. You hear a nearby conversation where one elder beekeeper defends his peculiar design. The herbs in the nosepiece soothe them, he insists. Another scoffs, more like you enjoy the smell while we sweat. A third adds with a grin, at least the bees don't laugh at your face. The group bursts into quiet chuckles, careful not to disturb the nearby hives. What's clear to you is that these odd designs reflect the beekeeper's constant struggle balancing genuine risk with a kind of ritualized comfort. The longer snouts gave a sense of distance from danger, as if a few extra inches of fabric could keep the buzzing horde farther away. You step closer and notice small breathing holes drilled into some of the longer snouts, an attempt to allow airflow while minimizing open gaps that bees could exploit. Others even include wire mesh inserts, an early prototype of modern respirator filters. Ingenious slightly, effective not entirely. And yet, these peculiar hybrid designs persisted in pockets across Europe, especially among more rural, tradition-bound communities, where superstition ran side by side with daily labor. You observe another keeper carefully oiling the brim of his oversized hat. Keeps the rain out, he explains. Wet veils sag. Sagging veils mean stings. His hat features a tall dome, reinforced with layered linen, stitched to a wooden ring base. It sways slightly as he moves like an absurd parasol balanced atop his head. Here's where things take an even stranger turn. Some beekeepers began incorporating glass eyepieces into their plague-inspired designs. Large circular lenses gave them a wide, insect-like stare, while keeping their eyes protected. Unfortunately, as with earlier attempts at glass panels, sunlight often turned these lenses into tiny frying pans against the skin. You hear one younger assistant mutter, adjusting his fogged lenses. They said I'd look like a wise apiarist. I look like a drunken owl. His mentor just laughs. Better an owl than a pincushion. The desire for full-face protection battled constantly with the limitations of 18th century materials. Linen was breathable, but flimsy. Leather was sturdier, but stifling. Wire mesh offered airflow, but distorted vision. Each new hat design was its own compromise between safety, comfort, and practicality. You marvel at how each beekeeper's headgear reveals his personal philosophy toward risk. Some prefer mobility and vision, trusting their calm hands and skill. Others hedge their bets, building fortresses atop their heads to avoid even a single sting. And here's your fringe debate. Some modern scholars suggest that the more elaborate these hats became, the more they served as performative displays, both for clients buying honey and for neighbors sizing up a beekeeper's reputation. The hat became part of the beekeeper's professional identity, signaling both caution and expertise. You step back as another keeper puffs smoke into a hive. The long snouted hat bobs rhythmically with each exhale, like some strange wooden bird feeding from an invisible flower. The bees, lulled by the smoke, retreat deeper into the comb. And you realize this isn't just about hats. It's about the deeply human need to find protection in ritual to tame nature, with tools both practical and symbolic to armor oneself not only against danger, but against fear. But even stranger designs lie ahead. Because as materials evolved, so did the hats, leading to new experiments with straw, felt, metal, and wire that made 18th century beekeeping headgear even more peculiar. You wander farther down the dirt path, where the orchard begins to give way to open fields, dotted with scattered skeps and more beekeepers preparing for afternoon hive inspections. The sun hangs heavy now, glinting off their increasingly bizarre headgear like a parade of improvised sculptures. Here's where the real creative experimentation begins. These are not just wide-brimmed straw hats anymore. You're staring at an evolving laboratory of protection built from whatever materials 18th century beekeepers could get their hands on. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the mid-18th century, many beekeepers abandoned purely cloth veils in favor of combining rigid structures with softer barriers. Hats grew wider, veils became longer, and reinforcements like wire hoops, wooden ribs, and metal mesh started appearing regularly across Europe. You pause next to a particularly proud gentleman who offers to demonstrate his latest creation. His hat is enormous, its stiff felt dome sitting atop a solid wooden ring that holds the veil away from his face like the framework of a small tent. Dangling from this structure is fine wire mesh, not too heavy, not too loose. He knocks on the side with his knuckles. Sturdy enough for a goose to land on, he jokes. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some inventive beekeepers even layered two veils, one of coarse linen, one of fine mesh, believing that bees too small to push through one layer might get confused or trapped between them. It worked well enough, provided you didn't mind constantly untangling the veils when they rubbed against one another like fussy curtains in a windstorm. Historians still argue whether this layering strategy offered real protection or simply provided psychological comfort. One theory suggests that many 18th century safety innovations had more to do with calming the keeper's nerves than truly deterring the bees. A calm beekeeper, after all, is far less likely to provoke a swarm. You now study the variety of materials being employed. Straw remained popular for its lightness and availability. It was cheap breathable and could be easily woven into broad-brimmed shapes. Felted wool added sturdiness, particularly for wealthier beekeepers who could afford custom millinery work. It also helped repel moisture important during spring showers. Wire mesh, though expensive, provided valuable visibility while keeping stingers at bay. Wooden hoops or canes offered frame structures that kept fabric veils safely suspended away from delicate skin. You watch a pair of keepers debate the merits of their chosen materials. One taps the stiff brim of his felt hat, keeps its shape through winter. His neighbor lifts his straw creation with a grin, and mine won't boil my head come August. But the materials weren't simply chosen for function. You can't help but notice the subtle touches of style creeping in. Decorative braiding around brims, embroidered initials stitched into veils, painted floral motifs on some wealthier keepers' wooden frames. Here's where fashion and superstition begin to blend. In some regions, colored embroidery was believed to ward off evil humors or bad luck during hive work. One older woman proudly displays a crimson ribbon tied around her brim. "Keeps the devil from tempting the queen," she says with a knowing nod. You don't argue. You wander toward a distant apiary owned by a local nobleman where yet another design innovation catches your eye. His keepers wear rigid conical hats with thin metal bands circling the frame like miniature bird cages. The effect is both elegant and faintly ridiculous. The metal offers excellent support for the veils, but clinks faintly when they walk, producing an odd musical rhythm with every step. And here's your fringe debate. Some modern historians theorize that the wide brims and exaggerated designs also acted as early forms of protective personal space, creating a larger buffer zone that discouraged bees from targeting the head directly. Others argue this was purely incidental with no evidence bees altered flight behavior based on hat size. You glance up as a gust of wind picks up momentarily, lifting one man's heavy linen veil toward his face, before the wooden frame snaps it back into place. The design works, but only just. The hats continue to evolve right before your eyes. Part experiment, part local tradition, part superstition, part practicality. And yet, no two look entirely the same. Every beekeeper here is essentially wearing his or her own prototype, and you're starting to realize these weren't simply tools. They were symbols of a beekeeper's identity, ingenuity, and often their level of fear. But hats didn't exist in a vacuum. Social class, court fashion, and even broader cultural influences would soon start leaving their fingerprints on beekeeper headgear, sometimes with surprising results. And that's exactly where you're headed next. You step closer now, drawn not by the hats themselves this time, but by the quiet, deliberate choreography unfolding around the hives. Each beekeeper seems to move according to an unspoken rhythm, a careful practiced ritual, and every strange hat is part of the performance. You pause beside an elderly beekeeper preparing for his afternoon inspection. His tall, wire-framed hat sways gently as he adjusts the layers of veils cascading down his shoulders. Around him, the younger apprentices copy his every motion with almost religious devotion. This is the beekeeper's ritual dance. One misstep, and you're no longer a participant, but a target. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Beekeepers of the 18th century developed entire routines for approaching and handling their hives. These movements weren't arbitrary. They were designed to minimize disruption, reduce the risk of swarming, and keep bees and beekeepers calm. The hat and veil were only part of this full-body choreography. You watch as the beekeeper breathes deeply, slows his movements, and lifts his smoker, a simple bellows attached to a hollow container of smoldering twigs. A gentle puff of white smoke drifts into the hive's entrance. and the bees respond exactly as planned, retreating, confused, docile. Timing, it seems, is everything. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some 18th century beekeepers believed that reciting calming phrases or singing softly while approaching the hive helped to soothe the bees. Whether it worked or merely steadied the beekeeper's own nerves remains up for debate. But you hear soft murmurs nonetheless. Steady wings, sweet ones. Let me borrow your gold. Historians still argue whether the ritualistic nature of these movements was driven by genuine bee science or centuries of accumulated superstition passed down like sacred knowledge. Some suggest the consistency of ritual created predictability for both bees and humans. Fewer surprises meant fewer stings. The hat, of course, plays a central role in the dance. You watch as a younger apprentice struggles to adjust his veil when a breeze sends it flapping against his face. His mentor gently tugs it back into place. "Secure your edges," he says softly. Loose veils tempt curious wings. The hat isn't simply protection, it's an extension of the beekeeper's confidence. Without the wide brim holding the veil steady, the whole dance becomes more dangerous. Bees love weak points, a bit of exposed skin, a collapsed veil, and unexpected motion. You notice how experienced keepers keep their hands low and steady, rarely raising them above shoulder level. "Don't reach across the hive," one master whispers to his apprentice. They see sudden shadows as threats. Here's another fringe debate. Some modern entomologists propose that the beekeeper's ritualistic movements may have unintentionally aligned with how bees perceive threats visually. Rapid changes in light and movement may trigger defense mechanisms, while slow, predictable actions avoid setting off alarms. Whether they knew the science or simply learned by painful trial, 18th century beekeepers had figured out what worked. As the inspection continues, you see the smoker's roll woven into the dance. The keeper puffs, waits, watches, then lifts the comb frame with exaggerated care. The bees move sluggishly, their normal sharp buzz dampened into a low, droning hum. And yet, for all this careful preparation, accidents still happen. You witness one tense moment as a young beekeeper accidentally bumps a heavy frame, jolting the hive. Instantly, a small swarm of guard bees bursts upward, circling his head. The apprentice freezes, breathing through his veil. His mentor quickly steps in, puffing a larger cloud of smoke between the bees and the boy. The swarm scatters, and the crisis dissolves. The hat, the veil, the smoke, they all work together as a fragile safety net. But only if the beekeeper respected the dance. Nearby, you hear two experienced keepers sharing quiet wisdom. "Most stings don't come from angry bees," one says. "They come from foolish hands." The design of the hat even influences posture. You notice that many of the wider brim designs naturally encourage keepers to tilt slightly forward, keeping their faces angled downward and away from the hive entrance. Yet another layer of protection, born not of theory, but practice. And here's something else you start to realize. The dance itself may have been a kind of unspoken community code. The more experienced you were, the smoother your movements, the better your hat was secured, the more respect you commanded within the group. The hat wasn't just a shield, it was a badge of discipline. You step back watching the apiary hum, as dozens of keepers perform their strange ballet in synchronized silence, smoke drifting like ghosts between them. The hats sway gently as the keepers move strange and beautiful monuments to humanity's ongoing attempt to collaborate with nature, while keeping just enough distance to avoid disaster. And yet, this is still only part of the story. Because soon as beekeeping knowledge advanced, scientists would enter the scene, bringing a whole new layer of logic observation, and surprisingly, even stranger hat designs. You shift now from the smoky dance of the apiary to the quieter, more bookish corners of 8th century society, where curious minds, rather than trembling hands, sought to unlock the mysteries of bees. This is where science begins to nudge its way into the world of beekeeping, and with it, an unexpected influence on those increasingly strange hats. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The 18th century saw a surge in natural philosophy, what we'd now call science. Early entomologists and naturalists grew fascinated with bees, dissecting hives, studying colonies, and observing bee behavior with a rigor that previous generations hadn't quite attempted. You find yourself now standing beside one of these curious gentlemen, a naturalist dressed not in the usual beekeeping garb, but in a hybrid of laboratory coat and protective gear. His hat, while still wide-brimmed and veiled, has an unmistakable air of academic design, stiff, clean lines, reinforced wire mesh eye panels, and little flaps to cover his ears. He looks more like an inventor than a farmer. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some scientific beekeepers experimented with magnifying glasses embedded into their veils to get a closer look at the hive without risking stings. The problem: they often forgot how easily the lenses caught sunlight, heating up and fogging over in seconds. Roasted eyeballs were not part of the plan. Historians still argue whether this surge of scientific interest truly improved safety or simply made hats more elaborate. Some scholars point out that many new designs prioritized observation over comfort, while others argue that science finally offered real solutions like refining mesh sizes and recommending lighter, breathable fabrics that genuinely helped prevent stings. You observe one naturalist slowly documenting hive behavior, while two assistants carefully lift frames for him. His notes are meticulous, queen-located, brood pattern consistent, guard bees show increased activity, additional smoke advised. Even his assistants' hats have small sewn-in pockets to hold tiny notebooks and charcoal pencils. Every movement is both experiment and performance. Here's something the earlier generations hadn't fully grasped. Bees weren't simply unpredictable flying needles. Their behavior followed patterns, many tied to scents, temperatures, hive condition, even weather. The more these naturalists understood, the more they could design clothing and hats that worked with bee behavior rather than blindly defending against it. You overhear a debate between two scholars discussing airflow under the hat's veil. One insists on a rigid cage structure that keeps fabric 6 inches from the face, while the other advocates for a looser drape to allow better ventilation. Stale air agitates the breath, one says. Cool, moving air soothes both man and bee. You realize now how deeply the hat has become an experimental object, a tiny laboratory of its own, where airflow, light, temperature, scent, and vision all battle for priority inside that bizarre dome. Every beekeeper tinkers, adjusts, revises. One particularly ambitious apiarist even tries adding small ventilation flaps to his veil, operated by tiny pull strings. You can't help but smile when, as he demonstrates, a strong breeze flutters his entire contraption like a collapsing tent. His assistant quickly grabs the frame to prevent an accidental veil-to-face collision. The man mutters, "Still some adjustments to make." Here's your fringe debate. Some modern historians argue that these early scientific innovations helped prevent beekeeping from stagnating, offering practical safety improvements just as more people, especially in urban areas, began keeping bees for personal gardens and small-scale honey production. Others claim these experimental hats were largely novelties too expensive and finicky for everyday use. You follow one group of naturalist beekeepers returning to their field notebooks after a hive inspection. They sit in the shade, their elaborate hats resting beside them, revealing sweat-drenched foreheads and hair matted flat. One jokes, "The bees may not sting my face, but these contraptions might roast my brain first." Still, the sacrifice seems worth it. These scholars are laying the foundation for the breakthroughs that would come in the following century, understanding queen behavior, hive hierarchies, swarming triggers, and colony health. Their hats may look ridiculous, but their data will change beekeeping forever. And of course, their hats influence the everyday beekeeper too. Local farmers hear rumors of new designs, better mesh, stronger frames, lighter fabrics. Slowly, pieces of the scientific beekeeper's toolkit trickle into common practice. You step back as another naturalist lifts his rigid framed veil one last time to scribble a note. Next, study the effect of colored clothing on aggression. The experiments never stop. And as you leave this little academic oasis, you can feel the slow merging of worlds. The ritual dancers and the scientific observers are no longer so far apart. Both want the same thing: to safely harvest honey without ending the day covered in welts. But even as science offers logic, there's still another layer swirling through beekeeping hats, one far older than textbooks, folklore, magic, and superstition. And you're about to step straight into that world next. You leave the notebooks and magnifiers behind, now stepping into a quieter corner of the orchard, where reason gives way, once again, to something older, heavier, and deeply human superstition. The beekeepers here hum softly as they work, not as an experiment, but as tradition. Their hats are simpler than those worn by scientists, but they carry a different kind of power, woven not from new fabrics or better mesh, but from belief. Here's your mainstream historical fact. For centuries, even well into the 18th century, beekeeping remained entangled with folklore, magic, and ritual. Bees were seen not just as creatures of nature, but as messengers, omens, and sometimes even carriers of the soul itself. You stop beside an elderly woman whose hat is wide and heavy, its brim woven from thick straw layered with colored thread. Tiny charms dangle from its edge, small silver bells, knotted bits of red string, and tiny carved discs etched with symbols you don't recognize. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some believe that bells or metal charms could confuse or ward off ill winds that might anger the bees. Others thought the sound soothed them, imitating the natural hum of the hive and calming their spirits. Whether it worked or not, the practice was widespread in certain regions. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were protective adaptations or simply cultural inertia rituals that lingered long after their original meanings were lost. One theory suggests that these traditions offered a sense of control in the face of an unpredictable, dangerous craft. You listen as one keeper softly recites an old rhyme while lowering his veil. Speak kind to the bees or storms, you will see. Tell them of death or they'll sour your breath. In many parts of Europe, telling the bees was a real ritual. If a family member died, someone would approach the hive, gently tap the skep, and inform the bees of the death so they wouldn't swarm or abandon the family. The beekeeper's hat became part of that solemn ceremony, almost priestly in function. You pass a young apprentice carefully threading a new protective charm onto the edge of his veil, a tiny sprig of rosemary wrapped in blue thread. His mentor nods approvingly. The queen favors calm hearts and steady hands. Let her know you come in peace. And here's where things grow even stranger. In some rural communities, certain hat designs incorporated not just physical protection, but spiritual symbols, embroidered crosses, protective runes, or even faint inked prayers hidden beneath the inner band of the hat. The idea was to guard the keeper's mind, not just his skin. You watch one beekeeper in particular, his hat adorned with 7 blue beads hanging from the brim. He explains without hesitation, 7's the number of harmony. Bees respect order. You suspect the bees are mostly responding to the steady hands behind the beads, but you say nothing. Here's your fringe debate. Modern folklorists argue whether these charms were deeply held beliefs or social performances, cultural habits passed down more for comfort than conviction. Others suggest they served as teaching tools, helping younger beekeepers stay calm by focusing on ritual rather than fear. As dusk falls and the last hive inspections conclude, you notice how these superstitious keepers handle even the closing rituals with care. Hives are gently covered with linen, and final puffs of smoke drift like incense offerings. One keeper quietly murmurs, "Rest now, my sisters," as if tucking the hive in for the night. Their hats, strange though they seem, reflect not ignorance, but a world still deeply connected to nature's mysteries, a world where humans stood only half in control, negotiating daily with unseen forces. And in this strange middle ground between science and superstition, the beekeeper's hat stands as both armor and talisman, shielding its wearer from stings and spirits alike. But even these traditions weren't uniform across Europe. as you're about to see the beekeeper's strange hat transformed even further, depending on where you traveled across borders, across climates, and across cultural expectations. You step now into the crossroads of Europe, where every border brings new languages, customs, and yes, new variations of those ever-strange beekeeper hats. The hum of bees follows you, but the designs change before your eyes, like regional dialects stitched into fabric wood and wire. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 18th century, different parts of Europe had developed distinct beekeeping traditions shaped by climate, local materials, and cultural norms. And each of those differences left its mark on the hats themselves. You begin in France. Here in the lush countryside of Provence, you watch as beekeepers move gracefully among rows of brightly painted hives, their headgear simple but elegant. Wide-brimmed straw hats dominate with fine white linen veils that hang loosely and lightly. The Mediterranean heat demands breathability. Heavy, elaborate headgear would cook them alive under the southern sun. One French keeper lifts his brim to wipe his brow and offers you a smile. The bees here are calm if you're gentle, he says. No need to frighten them with great cages on your head. His hat includes a clever drawstring at the base of the veil, cinched neatly around his collar to keep bees from slipping underneath. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some French beekeepers believed that lavender abundant in the region not only scented the honey, but also kept bees calmer. Some even rubbed lavender oil into the inner bands of their hats as a kind of fragrant charm. Whether the bees agreed remains unclear, but the humans certainly felt better. Historians still argue whether the French minimalist approach reflected superior bee handling skill or simply milder strains of bees cultivated through careful breeding. Some suggest their lighter equipment encouraged calmer hive behavior. Others credit pure luck of regional bee temperament. You move next into Germany, where the landscape shifts to dense forests and cooler mountain air. Here the hats grow taller, stiffer, and more rigid. Many German keepers wear conical felt or wool caps reinforced with wooden hoops and multiple layers of mesh. The brims are narrower, designed less for sun protection, and more to support the heavy veiling structure. You stop beside one German apiarist, tightening the leather straps of his rigid cage-like veil. The black bees here are aggressive, he explains. One tear in the net, and you may lose your sight. His hat includes cleverly integrated leather ear flaps that keep buzzing intruders out of his hearing canals, a detail you hadn't seen elsewhere. Next, you cross into England, where drizzle mists your shoulders and the buzz of bees softens under a gray sky. English beekeepers lean toward functionality: wide, felt brims with tightly woven veils falling straight down in plain sheets. Simplicity is king. Here's where class again makes its mark. In wealthier estates, you spot occasional embellishments, leather reinforcements along the veil's edges, polished wooden bands, or brass fittings used to weigh the veil neatly into place. But even here, practicality reigns. The cold, damp climate makes elaborate materials like straw less reliable. Wool and felt dominate. You overhear an English keeper chuckle while tightening his neat collar. We don't need French frills. A firm hand, calm voice, and good smoke, that's all. And here's your fringe debate. Some scholars argue these regional differences reveal more about cultural identity than about actual effectiveness. The Germans prized durability, the French favored elegance, the English clung to simplicity. Each group likely saw the other's designs as either dangerous or ridiculous. But you're not finished yet. You step further east into Poland, where some keepers still follow ancient Slavic traditions. Here you see beekeepers wearing woven bark hats, lined with fur, yes, fur. The fur helped insulate against harsh winters, while stiff inner rings held the veils upright. The buzzing bees seem unimpressed, but the keepers stay warm. One Polish elder taps the rim of his sturdy bark and leather headpiece. We have bears here too, he jokes. Sometimes I wonder whether my hat is meant for the bees or the beasts. You finally reach the edge of the Russian steppes, where a small community of skep keepers wears towering cylindrical hats wrapped in multiple layers of cloth. Some even stitch small religious icons into their veils, invoking saints for protection. The boundary between spiritual and practical grows thinner the farther you travel. You can't help but smile at how these strange hats, evolving independently, shaped by climate, danger, and belief, all serve the same purpose. In every country, every village, someone once faced the swarm and thought, "How can I survive this?" And from that question, these strange creations bloomed. The hats may look wildly different, but beneath every brim beats the same careful heart respect for the hive and fear of the sting. And yet, despite centuries of invention, the hats weren't always foolproof. Because soon, you'll witness how even the best gear sometimes failed, and how creativity flourished where danger lingered. You move closer now to the most humbling part of every beekeeper's life, when the strange hat fails. No matter how tall the brim, how fine the mesh, how rigid the frame, every beekeeper eventually faces the moment where a bee finds its way inside. And when that happens, things get tense. Here's your mainstream historical fact. No protective headgear of the 8th century was foolproof. Gaps formed, veils shifted, seams loosened. A single moment of carelessness, an improperly tied drawstring, a sudden gust of wind, or a poorly positioned movement could break the fragile barrier between calm work and full-blown panic. You watch now as one beekeeper pauses mid-inspection, going completely still. His hat, an impressive French design with multiple layers of embroidered veils, sways gently as he breathes. But inside, trapped, you hear it, the unmistakable high-pitched buzz of one very annoyed bee. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some keepers carried a small cloth or ribbon they called the prayer strip. If a bee entered the veil, they would slowly press this cloth against the inside of the mesh to pin or trap the invader without swatting wildly. A slow, careful pin. A tiny game of hostage negotiation. Historians still argue whether these strips were genuinely useful or mostly served to calm the beekeeper mentally, giving them something to do besides panic, while waiting for the bee to either settle or find its way out. You hold your breath as the beekeeper slowly lowers his bellows, keeps his hands steady, and tilts his head slightly so the bee might find its exit. His fellow keepers whisper softly, "Stay with your breath." No one moves to help. In this moment, it's his dance alone. The bee circles twice more, then slips through a fold in the veil and vanishes into the sky. Only then does the man exhale. Around him, the group lets out a quiet sigh of relief. You hear one veteran chuckle, "The hat keeps them out. The mind keeps you safe." But not everyone was so lucky. In more severe incidents, bees managed to enter poorly designed hats en masse. Once inside the confined space, they panicked, stinging wildly. Entire hives could be lost simply because the keeper had to abandon the task and flee, sometimes tearing the hat off entirely, often making things worse. Here's a fringe debate. Some modern historians believe these failures actually fueled innovation. Each terrifying incident pushed beekeepers to improve veil tension, collar fastenings, brim width, and airflow design. The hat evolved precisely because the danger never fully disappeared. You observe another beekeeper demonstrating his newest improvement, double-secured collar ties, made from soft leather strips instead of simple knots. The tighter the neck, he says, the less likely she finds her way inside. He tugs his chin strap firmly into place, offering a confident nod before facing the hive. The apprentices take notes. Everyone learns from every mistake, theirs or others. You also notice how even the materials themselves sometimes betrayed the keeper. Linen veils could sag under humidity. Straw brims warped in heavy rain. Metal mesh corroded if not properly maintained. Every beekeeper had stories of that day when their hat failed at the worst possible moment. You pause near a group of older keepers swapping tales of sting-filled disasters like soldiers recounting old battle wounds. 32 stings that day, one mutters, rubbing his shoulder. I couldn't eat solid food for a week. Another nods sagely. You lived. That's what matters. Even among the failures, you sense the deep respect they carry for both their craft and their tiny, volatile partners. Every mistake becomes part of the living folklore of beekeeping, part cautionary tale, part badge of honor. And still, despite these dangers, no one gives up the hat entirely. The risk is simply managed better design by design, season by season. As one elderly beekeeper puts it with a half smile, no hat is perfect, but no hat is far worse. The lessons learned in these moments of failure soon led to the most fascinating and occasionally ridiculous attempts at innovation, as beekeepers pushed the boundaries of hat design into stranger and stranger territory. And that, of course, is where you're heading next. You move now into a chapter of almost comedic creativity, a period where beekeepers frustrated by the near misses and terrifying failures began inventing increasingly odd designs to try and outwit both bees and fate. If there was a strange material, bizarre shape, or outlandish theory floating around Europe, someone tried it on a beekeeper's head. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the late 18th century, as experimentation accelerated, some beekeepers began borrowing not just from milliners or scientists, but from armorers, engineers, and even theatrical costume makers. The hats became engineering puzzles, balancing visibility, breathability, weight, and protection, with results that ranged from brilliant to ridiculous. You step into a small workshop where one particularly ambitious beekeeper showcases his newest prototype. His hat resembles a small observatory dome mounted on his shoulders. Brass hoops hold rigid sheets of oiled parchment in place, with ventilation slits carved in geometric patterns around the head. It looks more like a diving bell than anything suited for bees. Total barrier protection, he says, proudly tapping the thick structure. Not a single bee inside all season. His assistant, not quite as enthusiastic, adds under his breath, but you can't hear anything either. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some inventors even tried integrating padded layers into the hats, assuming a sting's venom might be stopped by thick quilting. The problem, if the bee couldn't sting through it, often just crawled around looking for thinner spots and eventually found one. Historians still argue whether these overbuilt contraptions truly offered better protection or simply added new dangers. Overheating, restricted airflow, and fogged lenses sometimes cause dizziness or disorientation right next to fully active hives, arguably more dangerous than an exposed veil ever was. You watch as another design unfolds, a full metal cage structure shaped like an enormous bird cage. Thin brass ribs arc gracefully from shoulder pads up over the head, holding a taut mesh several inches from the face. The result is oddly elegant, but when a light breeze blows, the entire frame wobbles slightly, requiring constant hand adjustments. Nearby, a younger keeper tests his version, a collapsible spring steel frame that folds like an umbrella, allowing the hat to compact when not in use. It works at first, but as he demonstrates the spring mechanism, it snaps back too suddenly, slapping his own head. He winces, still refining that bit. And here's where practicality slowly creeps back into focus. Many beekeepers realized that the more complicated a design became, the more likely something could go wrong during a storm in summer heat, or when startled bees pushed them into hurried motion. One old master sums it up perfectly as he watches a younger man wrestle with his over-engineered contraption. The bees are simple creatures. Perhaps we should learn from them. Still, the experiments didn't stop. You observe designs where hats are coated with slippery waxes or oils, hoping to prevent bees from landing at all. Others apply thin sheets of mica to eye holes, allowing for visibility while sealing the face entirely. The result? Good vision, terrible heat management. You hear a beekeeper mutter to his colleague, "By the time I finish, I feel like the honey's being harvested out of me." Here's your fringe debate. Some modern historians suggest that these stranger designs reflect not just problem solving, but something deeply psychological. The hat became an object onto which keepers projected both their fears and their faith in human ingenuity, a visible symbol of control in the face of nature's unpredictability. You wander toward one final example, a keeper wearing a fully enclosed hood made of finely woven horsehair, supported by a delicate wooden framework. The entire structure sways slightly as he walks, but stays off his face perfectly. It's neither heavy nor suffocating. For a moment you think they might have finally figured it out. The keeper notices your interest. Not bad, eh? Took 3 years to get the balance right. His eyes twinkle with quiet pride. You realize that every strange hat you've seen is part of this long, winding conversation between fear and creativity, danger and dignity. Every failure sharpened the next attempt. Every sting became another blueprint for improvement. And yet, even as designs advanced, they still carried the weight of centuries of superstition and culture. Because the next wave of innovation wasn't entirely about safety anymore. It was about identity, and that's exactly where you're heading next. You step now into the quieter corners of the village, where the buzz of bees fades into soft conversation and community gatherings. Here, something unexpected is happening. The strange beekeeper hats are no longer only shields against stings, they're becoming part of how beekeepers are recognized, respected, even celebrated. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 8th century, as beekeeping became more organized and semi-professionalized, the beekeeper's hat started to evolve into a kind of uniform signaling, not just a craft, but a profession. Guilds, cooperatives, and regional beekeeper associations began to formalize their roles in society. You stroll through a town fair where local beekeepers proudly show off their wares: polished jars of honey, gleaming beeswax candles, even tiny combs of fresh honey still glistening inside wooden frames. And there, behind every booth, stand the beekeepers themselves, wearing their strange hats like personal banners. One elderly guildmaster wears an oversized dome-shaped hat, trimmed with narrow gold braid along the brim. His veil is embroidered with his family crest, a tiny stitched bee flanked by leaves. 40 years I've worked the hives, he tells you, standing proudly. This hat tells my story. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some guilds issued special badges or colored ribbons attached to the hats, marking seniority or mastery. A novice might wear plain linen. A master might add a stripe of silk or even tiny brass tokens sewn into the brim's edge. These tokens jingled softly when the beekeeper walked a kind of mobile resume. Historians still argue whether these guild symbols were primarily about professional pride or social theater. Some see them as helpful hierarchies, others as elaborate ways to gatekeep and preserve exclusive rights to honey production in certain regions. You watch as a younger apprentice nervously approaches a group of senior keepers to present his new hat for inspection, a rite of passage. His frame is lighter, made of fine willow wood, his veil meticulously hand-stitched by his family. The older keepers examine the stitching, the balance of the frame, even the knots securing the neck. After a few tense moments, one nods. You'll do. It dawns on you that these hats carry more than function. They reflect skill, lineage, patience, and reputation. You overhear two keepers comparing local designs. In the north, they still favor those stiff felt cones, one says. But down south, they've shifted to lighter straw with oak supports. The other nods. Both work, but you can always tell where a man learned his craft by how he wears his veil. Here's your fringe debate. Modern anthropologists suggest that the beekeeper's hat served as a rare instance of occupational identity, bleeding into personal identity in pre-industrial society. The hat wasn't just workwear, it was a lifelong badge of belonging to a very particular world. You pass by a small wedding celebration where a local beekeeper offers honey cakes to guests. His ceremonial hat, far grander than his usual field gear, gleams with polished wood and an intricate silver filigree crest at the top. It's not for hive work, but for public display, his role as a respected figure woven into the fabric of the community. In some villages, you learn the beekeeper's hat even played a role in local superstitions and blessings. Newlywed couples might borrow a master beekeeper's hat briefly for good fortune, believing the bees' harmony would transfer to their marriage. A curious blend of faithcraft and community ritual. And yet, for all this symbolism, practicality still lurked beneath. You see apprentices practicing how to handle their veils properly, how to check for small holes, secure the drawstrings tightly, and store the hats carefully between uses to prevent moth damage. You listen as one master gives his advice. A hat tells people who you are. But it also keeps you alive. Never forget both. You realize that in these hats lies something rare. A tool born of real danger, evolved through necessity, but ultimately transformed into something deeply human identity, wrapped in cloth and wood, sealed with tradition. But even identity wasn't the end. Because the world was changing rapidly, and as new inventions loomed, many of these strange, beautiful hats would soon face extinction, replaced by something far more standardized. And that's exactly where you're going next. You step forward now into a world on the cusp of transformation. The old guild masters, the ornate crests, the carefully balanced wire frames, all are about to collide with something far more disruptive: industrialization. And with it comes the slow demise of the strange, personalized beekeeper's hat. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the early 19th century, as industrial manufacturing techniques, advanced beekeeping equipment, including protective clothing, began to shift from individually crafted, locally sourced designs into mass-produced, standardized models. The days of handmade, one-of-a-kind hats were numbered. You find yourself in a bustling city market where new beekeeping suppliers hawk their latest wares. Stacks of nearly identical veils, framed smokers, and hats sit neatly packaged, ready for purchase. The hats simpler, more uniform. Lightweight cotton veils attached to metal hoops supported by basic felt or canvas caps. Functional, efficient, and strangely soulless. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some of these early mass-produced hats were sold in catalogs, alongside gardening tools, sewing machines, and farm equipment. You could order your entire apiary kit, including protective gear, without ever speaking to a guild master or consulting a village elder. Historians still argue whether this shift was truly progress. Some point to the vastly improved accessibility, safer equipment, affordable to more people, fostering a boom in amateur beekeeping. Others mourn the loss of craftsmanship, culture, and identity embedded in those old, strange hats. You pause near one veteran beekeeper, shaking his head at a display of factory-made veils. They work, he admits with a shrug, but they've no heart. A man used to make his own gear, knew every stitch. His young apprentice smiles politely, but tugs on the elastic strap of his modern veil, lightweight, easy to wear, easy to clean. You notice how the very materials have changed. Synthetic mesh instead of hand-woven linen. Lightweight aluminum hoops replacing whalebone and wood. Standardized sizing instead of custom-fitted crowns. Replaceable parts sold by mail-order companies. The personal craftsmanship, the quiet evenings spent shaping willow branches, stitching embroidery, knotting leather ties, begins fading into memory. You overhear a supplier boast to a customer, "No more headaches." Durable, breathable, tested by professionals. Guaranteed fit. No more worrying about sagging veils or warped brims. Here's your fringe debate. Some modern cultural historians argue that this shift reflects a broader transition in Western society, from artisanal craft economies to impersonal mass production. The beekeeper's hat is just one small example of how entire identities were flattened under the steamroller of industrial efficiency. And yet, even as you watch these changes take hold, you notice small rebellions. A few older keepers still wear their handmade hats for local fairs or ceremonial events, their brims slightly warped, their stitching faded, but their pride intact. One woman adjusts her mother's old willow-framed veil and smiles. They call these antiques now. You walk through one final apiary where tradition and modernity collide. Younger keepers in factory-issued veils work beside elders wearing carefully preserved family hats. They share honey stories and quiet jabs about whose gear is better. The bees, of course, don't care either way, as long as the smoke is steady and the hands are gentle. You realize that while the strange hats may be fading from everyday use, their legacy lingers woven into the collective memory of a profession shaped by risk, patience, and endless creativity. Because even as the industrial veil became dominant, echoes of the old designs would ripple forward into the present day, right up to the bee suits and helmets still worn by modern beekeepers now. And that brings you to the final chapter of this strange, buzzing journey. You step now into the world, you know the world of today. And yet, as you watch modern beekeepers quietly tending their hives, the echoes of those strange 18th century hats still hum gently in the background, like a fading chorus beneath the steady buzz of wings. Here's your mainstream historical fact. While modern beekeeping suits and veils are worlds apart from the towering, elaborate hats of the past, their purpose remains unchanged to strike a delicate balance between protection and practicality, safety and comfort. You watch as a young beekeeper dons her gear. She pulls on a full suit of lightweight fabric, ventilated, zippered, elasticized. The veil attaches securely to her wide-brimmed helmet, the mesh crisp and fine, the lines clean. The result, utterly effective, entirely unremarkable, efficient to the point of being invisible. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some companies now offer veils with built-in fans, air conditioning units, and even Bluetooth speakers. Yes, today you can listen to podcasts while tending your hive, entirely safe, comfortably cool, and perfectly entertained as thousands of bees swirl around your head. Historians still argue whether this modern perfection represents a final triumph of science over tradition, or whether something essential was lost along the way. Some argue that modern gear removes the intimacy and discipline that once defined beekeeping as an art form. You pause beside an elderly hobbyist unpacking his equipment. Beside his standard-issue modern suit sits a carefully wrapped relic, his grandfather's old willow-framed veil, delicate and slightly yellowed. He runs a hand over the worn fabric. My family wore this for 3 generations. They earned their honey. You nod, understanding now how these strange hats once embodied far more than simple protection. They reflected fear, ingenuity, superstition, pride, and community. 1,000 tiny decisions stitched into every fold. Nearby, a few niche artisans are bringing pieces of the old world back. You see hand-woven veils made from organic linen, handcrafted wooden frames, even specialty embroidery stitched into the brims for ceremonial purposes. Not because they're necessary, but because they honor the long, winding story that led here. Here's your fringe debate. Some modern apiarists now study those antique designs for forgotten wisdom, seeking clues in the past that might help address present-day challenges like colony collapse, invasive mites, and shifting climates. The strange hats are becoming artifacts not of failure, but of resourcefulness. You observe a new generation of beekeepers learning the craft, mixing modern convenience with old respect. They read ancient beekeeping poems. They whisper to their bees. They move slowly, calmly, as their ancestors did, whether or not they wear ventilated nylon or willow-framed veils. As the sun dips low, you hear one young keeper murmur the old phrase you've heard whispered again and again on this journey. Steady hands, soft breath, calm heart. And in that simple line, you feel the entire weight of the centuries settle into place. The hats may have changed. The gear may have improved. But the dance between humans and bees remains as delicate, beautiful, and humbling as ever. Because at its core, beekeeping isn't just about hats or honey or even safety. It's about learning how to live alongside something small, fragile, and utterly wild, without ever forgetting how easily it can turn. And now, let's wind things down together.